to my second podcast in this series of Life After Loss. So this podcast is called Navigating the Waves, and this is basically about looking at what it's like to overcome loss and grief using some models that we most likely all of us have heard of before, but looking at them through a bit of a different lens and to gather some further understanding of what people experience and go through when they experience quite a significant loss. So today, grief waves, the traditional model of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and the 5 stages of grieving, they are valid. They give us an understanding of some of the complex emotions that we go through when we lose loved ones. But there is a bit of criticism about this model because it suggests that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end to grieving. And that is not everybody's experience. It doesn't complete, like acceptance suggests that the cycle's completed. And it's not necessarily like that in the real world. For many of us, when we experience significant loss, we have waves of emotions that come over us and memories, and these are often triggered by everyday events, everyday tasks that we do. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own story. If you've listened to the first podcast, you already know, but just to fill in some newbies, I was widowed at the age of 24 through suicide. And for me, what the model didn't capture for me was the absolute shock that I've talked about before that I went through that literally lasted months. And I think also when we lose people to suicide, there's a lot of questions that remain unanswered, and they are very triggering as well. So an example for me would be watching or making tea and a programme being on the television, and that would be a programme that would be on, that my husband would come home. It's actually The Simpsons. And that music, when that came on, there was a split second of me who really was half expecting him to walk through the door. And I know I've heard other people say that they just want to pick up the phone, they want to reach out to their loved one, and then they realise and they remember that that person's not around anymore. And other things can trigger it as well. I still get it a bit. I lost my gran when I was 21. We were very, very close. And still sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes when I hear the sound of a crutch, the metal sticks that people use for support, it makes like a clunking sound, like a metally clunking sound. And still, when I hear that, it takes me back to my grandma, to my gran. And smells can do it as well. So when I was a little girl, my grandma used to give me makeup and stuff in an old handbag of hers. And there was all powder crushed on the bottom, and it had a particular fragrance, a particular smell. And I can still, if I come across that smell or something that reminds me, it takes me right back to being a young person and having my grandma around. But it was a death that I was able to come to terms with quite naturally because of the circumstances around my grandma's death. So it doesn't trigger a huge amount of pain or discomfort. It's a wistfulness, wishing she was here to share my life. And that's what people tell me. And from what I've read and researched, these are quite common everyday things, smells, sounds, memories, or even visiting places that you used to go together, and then going there again after the loss, after the death. That can be quite triggering as well. I feel like we need to let go of this understanding that life is linear, that life has, well, obviously it does have a beginning and a middle and an end, but when we go through traumatic events and then as we get older or move on, we can still find ourselves back there sometimes, going over old things, hopefully with renewed perspective, and understanding. But sometimes if we're feeling low, these events can be quite triggering. And that was something else that I found after going through the loss of a loved one to suicide. Whenever anything else went wrong in my life, I really felt I would go back and I would tell myself stories, which I later learned, I realised actually that I was doing it. I hadn't realised I was doing it. And that's quite an important step, is about the stories we tell ourselves, but we'll dive into that a bit later on. But yeah, so for me, life and coming to terms with loss and death and change, it's not linear. It's more cyclical. It's something we come back to again and again for different reasons, anniversaries, all different kinds of examples that I've already gave. We come back to them again, but hopefully we can begin to have a renewed perspective for that incident or that moment in our lives. Grief waves, also known as grief bursts, these are sudden and intense feelings and emotions that are triggered by events that can be everyday events. For me, from my experience, these waves often used to hit me hardest when I wasn't expecting them. So when you talk to people who have had traumatic and significant loss in their lives, they will tell you that the actual day or the anniversary that you've been building up to, whether that's a birthday, the anniversary of the death, a wedding anniversary, or whatever the circumstances are, we build ourselves up to it. And I personally found, and other people I've spoke to have said as well, that the build up to those events is often worse than the actual day itself, because we're prepared, we're considering it, we're processing it. And then when you get to the day, yes, you still feel those raw emotions. For me, I used to go back to the day that it happened. I could feel the same physical sensations that I had that day. And so that's like an occasion that we can prepare for. But then you might be in a restaurant or a bar and a particular song might come on, and that can be really triggering. That was really triggering for me. And it catches you off guard. You're not prepared for it. You're not thinking about it, but it just pops up, and that can be quite difficult to deal with. There's a grief expert who I've come across called J. William Warden, and he explains grief is not a task to be completed, but a process to be lived through. And this resonates really deeply with me, and it acknowledges the ongoing and unpredictable nature of grief. There's lots of other authors out there. There are some great books, and these can help us to feel less alone and understood. We might not be all experiencing the same things because we're all different, and the circumstances that we lose people in are different as well, and then they can trigger a different response. Like I've said before, suicide is a difficult death to come to terms with and to accept that that is what has happened, because it's just so unbelievable. So let's get back to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross with our 5 stages of grief, which are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And to be fair, when this model was first introduced, it was revolutionary. It provided us with a framework to understanding the grieving process. But it's important to remember that this model was based on research and work done with terminally ill patients, understanding the emotions that people go through when they realise that they're terminally ill. This helps us to understand. It's limited because it suggests that there's this linear process or progression through stages, and it doesn't reflect the diverse and personal nature of grief and bereavement. The model suggests a linear progression through stages, which doesn't reflect the diverse and personal nature of grief. People do not move through grief in a neat and orderly fashion. It can be a little bit all over the place, and from the outside looking in, that can actually be quite confusing to other people. So an example is when I'd lost my husband, my ex-husband, and then I'd met my next partner and we were dating. You do love this person, but I still felt like I was married to my first husband. And that can be tricky. And people did say it to us, but how are you grieving your first husband when you're already dating somebody else? And it's it just is what it is. And I've seen some chats on social media. There's a really interesting woman on TikTok who shares her grief journey after losing her partner. She'd shared that she had a boyfriend, and the comments really blew me away. People were saying things like, "You lost me a boyfriend." So people don't feel like you deserve empathy if you've already moved on. What are you crying about? You've already got a boyfriend. And I just wanted to highlight that for people watching who may be trying to understand somebody around them. And I was very lucky in that my new husband was very, very understanding of the position that I was in with my first husband. He didn't try and make me feel guilty or bad, or he didn't get jealous. He just totally accepted the way it was, and he commiserated with me when it was anniversaries and things like that, and I was feeling sad. He commiserated with me. So yeah, I just wanted to bring that up and clarify that really for people if they were a bit confused. How could somebody be grieving somebody but actually dating somebody else when it was a partner that they lost? So yes, grief is far more like a roller coaster. It's far more up and down. We have good days, we have bad days, and there is really no time limit on how long it takes somebody to come to terms and accept. And even when you do accept the loss of somebody, it doesn't mean that that person doesn't matter anymore, you don't care about them anymore. Another quote that I've found to read out to you is grieving practices vary significantly across cultures and time periods. Any model that doesn't account for this diversity is inherently limited. So we've got all different cultures and how they approach grieving and death. And in British culture, there is a taboo around talking about it. And we're not really exposed to death so much. But if we turn the clocks back, I know certainly my husband now said that his first memory of being a child was having a coffin with a relative in it in the living room. Children were a lot more exposed to death and dying. And now, certainly here, that's very rare that would happen. So how much time do we have to process the death? How much in our culture is it? And for me, it's very much pushed behind closed doors, and it's not something that's widely acknowledged after the event has happened. People, from my experience, want to move on, and they don't really want to think about depressing, sad things. And a theory that I have is that when we grieve people, especially people we don't know, there is a collective grief. It's often a reminder that life is not eternal, and there will be a time when we depart here. Sorry if that sounds depressing, but it's actually one of the only facts. And we don't really spend much time thinking about that. And people may not want to, but because of what I've been through, I've always been drawn to situations and scenarios where there has been grief and death. And I often, when I go into these spaces, I just want to share that there is hope. It can feel so hopeless when you're going through that in the moment. And it's important to believe that there is a life after loss, that you will feel joy in your heart again. And that's something that I really like to press forward for people when they ask. Life will never be the same again after a significant loss, but we can create a new reality, and that person will always be missing. I think it was an Elizabeth Kubler-Ross quote, and she said, life after a significant loss is like a jigsaw puzzle, but there'll always be one piece missing. And that really sums up life after loss. But it's about life is different, and it is possible to feel real joy after you've lost someone. It just takes time to process where you are, what's happened, and to be able to feel that joy again. Another quote I have to share with you is from Dr. Alan Woolfelt, and he's a grief counsellor. And he describes these grief bursts as temporary but intense periods of emotion that signify the depth of the relationship with the deceased. So hopefully this can give people some kind of understanding of what other people might be going through. And I think the criticism of the model is that people accept death and then move on from death. And that's not necessarily true. Say, for example, somebody's lost a child, they're back to work, it's years later, and then the person gets upset at work or with friends. And I had this happen to me. People saying, you really should be over this now. This shouldn't be still having this effect on you or impact on you. And it's limiting, and it makes the person feel like there's a judgment on them, that there's something wrong with them. Why am I feeling the way I am? Why haven't I completed this grief? Why don't I feel better again? And, most of the time you do, and that's what I say. You'll find is that to begin with, it's just all horrible days. Then you might have a good hour where you actually forgot about what's happened. And in the beginning, that can be quite hard because you've then got to remember the situation that you're in. But eventually those bumps, those peaks and troughs, they start to level out a bit more, and you start to feel like you're here. You're not thinking about what's past. You're not thinking about your loved one all the time anymore. Or if you are, you're still able to have moments of joy, and that 1 hour of joy might turn into a day of joy. And then you might have a week of joy, and then you might go back again and really, due to a memory or an anniversary, go back to it again. And it's really like that. And the good days just get more and the bad days just get better. That was my experience, and people that I've talked to and spent time with afterwards. So I'm going to wrap it up. We've explored the concept of grief waves. We've critiqued the Kubler-Ross model and emphasised that grief really is a deeply personal journey that doesn't follow a set path or a timeline. And it's okay to experience grief in our own way and allow ourselves to feel and express the emotions around us without judgment, so we can understand why somebody who lost a child 5 years ago still gets really upset, and to not place an expectation that shouldn't be happening anymore. If you have any questions or stories, I'd really like you to reach out. I'd really like you to share my podcast, please. Help it get out there. And I just really want people to know that you are not alone. Underneath the video, there will be different resources, groups, lines, people that you can contact if you feel like you're struggling. Please reach out. Reach out to friends, reach out to colleagues, just reach out. Don't bottle that all up. We often find that by talking about things, it can help us to process things as well. So yes, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week. Thank you very much.